stepped off the city bus with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding public transportation for months. His worn leather shoes hit the pavement with a soft thud, and he adjusted the collar of his simple button-down shirt. To any observer, he looked like just another middle-aged man struggling to make ends meet after a difficult divorce. The truth was far more complex. Ted had built his entire post-divorce life around this carefully constructed facade. Every morning, he would leave his modest apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Riverside Heights, take the bus to downtown, and spend his days at the public library or coffee shops, maintaining the appearance of a man searching for work. What no one knew, not his ex-wife Lucille, not her new husband Raymond Newman, not even his own children, was that Ted Graham was worth over $50 million. The transformation had taken 2 years to perfect. After discovering Lucille's affair with Raymond, a successful real estate developer, Ted had quietly liquidated his tech consulting business through a series of shell companies. His partners never knew he was the silent owner of the algorithms that had made their firm one of the most sought after in Silicon Valley. While they thought they were buying him out during the divorce proceedings, Ted had actually sold them technology he'd already replaced with something far more advanced. The divorce had been brutal. Lucille's lawyer, armed with private investigators and financial experts, had dissected Ted's apparent assets with surgical precision. They found his modest consulting income, his small savings account, and the heavily mortgaged house they'd shared for 15 years. What they didn't find were the offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency wallets, or the intellectual property holdings that constituted his real wealth. Ted's phone buzzed as he walked down Fifth Street. A text from his eldest daughter. "Monica, Dad, can you make it to dinner Sunday? Mom says you've been struggling, and we thought." He deleted the message without finishing it. Monica had chosen her side during the divorce, believing her mother's carefully crafted narrative of Ted's supposed failures as a husband and provider. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Lucille paraded around town with Raymond, spending what she thought was the majority of Ted's assets from their settlement, Ted was quietly assembling the pieces of his revenge. It had taken 18 months of patient observation, careful planning, and strategic positioning. Now, as he approached the Starbucks where he'd accidentally encountered them today, Ted allowed himself a small smile. The coffee shop was busy with the usual lunch crowd. Ted ordered his regular, a small coffee, black, and found a table near the window. He pulled out a worn paperback novel and settled in to wait. Patience had become his greatest virtue since the divorce. Every move had to be calculated, every encounter planned down to the last detail. At 2:15 p.m., exactly as their routine dictated, Lucille and Raymond walked through the door. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Raymond Newman was everything Ted appeared not to be: tall, confident, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His success in real estate had made him a prominent figure in the city's social circles, and Lucille basked in the reflected glory. Ted watched them order their drinks, a non-fat vanilla latte for her, an espresso for him, and find a table across the room. They were creatures of habit, these two. It made them predictable, and predictability was a weakness Ted had learned to exploit. Ted Graham. Lucille's voice carried across the coffee shop with calculated surprise. She approached his table with Raymond trailing behind, her expression a perfect mask of concerned ex-wife. "I almost didn't recognize you." Ted looked up from his book, feigning mild embarrassment. "Oh, hi, Lucille." "Raymond." He nodded politely to the man who had destroyed his marriage. "Still taking the bus?" Lucille asked, her tone carrying just enough mockery to sting while maintaining plausible deniability. "I saw you getting off the number 12 when we drove past earlier." Raymond shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly recognizing the cruelty in his wife's comment. For all his faults, he wasn't entirely without conscience. "Lucille," he said quietly, a warning in his voice. But Ted was ready for this moment. He'd been preparing for it for months. "Yeah, well, you know how it is," he said with a self-deprecating shrug. "Budget's pretty tight these days." As he spoke, Ted raised his coffee cup to his lips, and Raymond's eyes locked onto his wrist. The watch was subtle, no flashy gold or ostentatious diamonds, but Raymond Newman knew luxury when he saw it. His face went pale as he processed what he was looking at. That's a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, Raymond whispered, his voice barely audible. That's a $2 million limited edition. Ted glanced down at his wrist, as if noticing the watch for the first time. Oh, this old thing. He smiled with practiced nonchalance. Family heirloom. Grandfather left it to me. Lucille's face had gone from smug satisfaction to confusion to dawning horror in the span of seconds. She knew Ted's family history better than anyone. His grandfather had been a coal miner who died without a penny to his name. But that's impossible, she stammered. The divorce settlement. Your assets. We had investigators. Ted stood up slowly, his book tucked under his arm. Assets can be very tricky things, Lucille. Sometimes they're right where you least expect them. He turned to Raymond, whose face had now gone from pale to ashen. Nice seeing you both. Take care. As he walked out of the coffee shop, Ted could hear the urgent whispers behind him. The first crack in their perfect world had just appeared, and Ted Graham was just getting started. Chapter 2. The Foundation. The penthouse apartment overlooking Harbor Bay was nothing like the modest studio in Riverside Heights where Ted maintained his public residence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, while carefully curated art pieces adorned the walls, investments that had appreciated considerably since Ted's quiet acquisitions through various auction houses. Ted poured himself 2 fingers of 30-year-old Macallan and settled into his leather chair, opening his laptop to review the surveillance reports. His team of private investigators had been tracking Lucille and Raymond for over a year, building comprehensive profiles of their habits, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. What they discovered went far beyond simple adultery. The affair had started 3 years before their divorce, when Lucille began working as an interior designer for Raymond's real estate developments. Their relationship had been built on a foundation of mutual greed and social ambition. Raymond saw in Lucille a refined, cultured woman who could help him break into the city's elite social circles. Lucille saw in Raymond the wealthy, successful husband she felt she deserved. What neither of them knew was that Ted had been aware of their affair from the beginning. His background in cybersecurity had made it child's play to monitor Lucille's communications. He'd read every text message, every email, listened to every phone call where they'd mocked his supposed inadequacies and planned their future together. They'd laughed about his mediocre consulting business, his boring personality, his lack of social connections. Most painfully, they'd speculated about how quickly they could push through a divorce and minimize Ted's share of what they assumed were modest marital assets. The divorce proceedings had been Ted's masterclass in strategic deception. He'd hired a deliberately mediocre lawyer, presented financial documents that showed exactly what he wanted them to see, and played the role of the wounded, naive husband to perfection. When Lucille Shark of an attorney had demanded 70% of their assets, Ted had reluctantly agreed after putting up just enough fight to make it seem realistic. Lucille had walked away with what she thought was the lion's share: the house, which Ted had secretly remortgaged to the hilt, his consulting business, which was already being dissolved, and most of their visible savings. Ted had kept his old truck, some personal belongings, and what appeared to be a modest retirement account. The judge had even ordered Ted to pay alimony, which he'd done with apparent reluctance. What made it perfect was that Ted's actual wealth existed in a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and intellectual property holdings that his own business partners didn't fully understand. The algorithms he developed weren't just valuable, they were revolutionary. Major tech companies had been quietly licensing his innovations for years through intermediary firms, generating revenue streams that Lucille's investigators never could have traced back to him. Ted's phone rang, interrupting his review. The caller ID showed Bob Briggs, his most trusted investigator. "They're panicking," Bob reported without preamble. Raymond spent 3 hours on the phone with his financial advisor after the coffee shop incident. Lucille called her divorce attorney twice and tried reaching the private investigator they used during the proceedings. And what do they find? Nothing yet, but they're looking harder. Raymond's particularly rattled. He knows watches, and seeing that Patek Philippe has him questioning everything he thought he knew about your financial situation. Ted smiled. Good. Fear makes people sloppy. What about the children? Bob's tone grew more serious. Monica and Stephen are still completely in the dark. They genuinely believe you're struggling financially. Last week, Monica tried to give you money for groceries, remember? The memory stung. Monica, his 23-year-old daughter, had approached him outside the library with $50 and tears in her eyes, begging him to accept help. She thought her father was too proud to admit he was barely getting by. What she didn't know was that her mother had been systematically poisoning her against Ted for 3 years, using his apparent financial struggles as evidence of his failures as a man and father. Stephen, his 20-year-old son, had been even more direct. He'd accused Ted of being a deadbeat who was trying to guilt-trip the family. The boy now lived with Lucille and Raymond, referring to Raymond as a real man who takes care of his responsibilities. Any change in their relationship with their mother? Ted asked. None. If anything, they're more protective of her now that she's remarried. They see Raymond as saving her from your supposed inadequacies. Ted closed his eyes. His children's betrayal cut deeper than Lucille's affair ever had. During the divorce, he'd hoped they would see through their mother's manipulation, but Lucille had been masterful in her campaign. She'd painted herself as the long-suffering wife of a man too weak and incompetent to provide for his family, finally finding happiness with someone who could give her the life she deserved. What about Raymond's business? That's where it gets interesting, Bob continued. Newman Development is highly leveraged right now. They're in the middle of 3 major projects that are all behind schedule and over budget. Raymond's been using personal assets as collateral to keep the company afloat, betting everything on a luxury resort development that's been plagued with problems. Ted leaned forward. What kind of problems? Environmental issues, permit delays, cost overruns. The initial investors are getting nervous, and Raymond's been scrambling to find additional funding. He's got about 6 months before the whole thing comes crashing down if he can't secure another $20 million in backing. This was exactly the kind of information Ted had been waiting for. Raymond's apparent success was built on a house of cards, and Ted now had a clear view of every supporting beam. Start phase 2, Ted instructed. I want you to make contact with the resort investors. Use the Morrison Group identity. They'll never connect it back to me. And Bob, make sure our friend Raymond knows that someone's been asking questions about his financial stability. After ending the call, Ted walked to his window and looked out at the city lights. 20 stories below, people were living their ordinary lives, unaware of the carefully orchestrated game being played in the shadows above them. In 6 months, maybe less, Lucille and Raymond would understand what it felt like to lose everything. But unlike Ted's manufactured poverty, their fall would be devastatingly real. The second phase of his revenge was about to begin. Chapter 3, The Bait. The Riverside Community Center's job training workshop was the perfect cover for Ted's next move. For 6 months, he'd been volunteering there twice a week, teaching basic computer skills to unemployed workers. It served multiple purposes. It reinforced his image as a man struggling to find purpose after his fall from grace. It provided him with a legitimate reason to be in the area, and most importantly, it had introduced him to Frank Wells. Frank was a 55-year-old former construction foreman who'd been laid off when the economy tanked. He was intelligent, desperate, and most crucially, he had 20 years of experience in large-scale construction projects. Ted had been cultivating their friendship for months, positioning himself as a fellow victim of circumstances beyond his control. You know, Frank, Ted said as they cleaned up after the evening's computer class, I keep thinking about what you said last week about those resort projects cutting corners on safety inspections. Frank looked up from stacking chairs. Yeah, it's getting worse out there. These developers are so focused on profit margins, they forget that real people are going to be living and working in these places. You mentioned Newman Development specifically. That's my ex-wife's new husband's company. Raymond Newman? Frank's expression darkened. That guy's a piece of work. I worked on 2 of his projects before I got laid off. Safety violations, substandard materials, bribing inspectors, the whole 9 yards. I tried to blow the whistle, but who's going to believe a laid-off construction worker over a guy with Newman's connections? Ted had been carefully steering their conversations toward this topic for weeks. Frank's accusations weren't just the bitter complaints of a disgruntled employee. Ted's investigators had confirmed every detail. Raymond's corner cutting went far beyond normal cost management. He was actively endangering lives to maximize profits. "That's terrible," Ted said with apparent sincerity. "But surely there's someone you could report this to?" Frank laughed bitterly. "I tried. Filed complaints with the city, the state, even contacted a couple of journalists. Newman's got too many people in his pocket. My complaints disappeared into the bureaucracy, and I got blacklisted from every major construction project in the tri-state area." This was exactly what Ted had hoped to hear. Frank Wells wasn't just a potential ally. He was a man with legitimate grievances and inside knowledge of Raymond's illegal activities. More importantly, he was someone who couldn't be traced back to Ted. "What if someone could give you proof?" Ted asked carefully. "Hard evidence that couldn't be ignored?" Frank stopped what he was doing and studied Ted's face. "What kind of proof?" Ted pulled out his phone and showed Frank a series of photographs. They showed construction workers at Newman development sites ignoring safety protocols, using substandard materials, and working on projects that clearly hadn't passed proper inspections. What Frank didn't know was that Ted had paid a team of professional photographers to document these violations over the past 6 months. "How did you get these?" Frank whispered. "Let's just say I've been doing some research on my ex-wife's new life," Ted replied. "I initially wanted to understand what she saw in him, but what I found was disturbing." Frank studied the images more closely. "This is the Ocean View project. See that steel framework in the background? Those support beams are rated for commercial use, not residential. The building plans I saw specified industrial-grade materials. Could you identify other violations if you saw more evidence?" "Absolutely. But Ted, if these photos got out, it would destroy Newman's company. We're talking about criminal charges, massive lawsuits, people losing their life savings." Ted met Frank's eyes. "Would that be such a terrible thing? How many people might get hurt if these violations go unreported?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. But even with these photos, I need access to the actual building plans, inspection reports, material purchase orders. Without documentation proving he intentionally used substandard materials, it's just a safety violation that could be explained away as contractor error. What if I told you I might be able to get you that documentation? I'd say you're playing a dangerous game. Newman's not just wealthy, he's connected. Cross him the wrong way, and you might find yourself in serious trouble." Ted smiled. "Frank, I've already lost everything that mattered to me. My wife, my children, my financial security, it's all gone. What's left for him to take?" What Frank didn't realize was that Ted's access to Raymond's documentation wasn't theoretical. Through his cybersecurity expertise and a carefully planned social engineering campaign, Ted had been collecting Newman Development's internal communications and files for months. He had emails discussing material substitutions, inspection reports that had been falsified, and financial records showing payments to city officials. But more than that, Ted had been using his vast resources to orchestrate a perfect storm around Raymond's business. The environmental issues plaguing the resort project, Ted had quietly funded the environmental groups that had filed the complaints. The permit delays? Ted's shell companies had been filing competing applications and appeals that gummed up the bureaucratic process. The cost overruns? Ted had been systematically outbidding Raymond's company for qualified subcontractors, forcing them to use inferior alternatives. "I need to think about this," Frank said finally. "Of course. But Frank, how many more buildings like these need to go up before someone gets seriously hurt? How many families need to lose their homes to shoddy construction before someone with the knowledge to stop it takes action?" As they walked out of the community center together, Ted could see the internal struggle playing out on Frank's face. The man wanted to do the right thing, but years of being ignored and marginalized had made him cautious. Ted's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., Central Park, South Entrance. Come alone." Raymond had taken the bait. The coffee shop encounter had rattled him enough to break his own rules about maintaining distance from Ted. Now he was making mistakes, acting emotionally instead of strategically. Everything okay? Frank asked, noticing Ted's expression. Just my ex-wife's husband, Ted replied with a weary sigh. Apparently, he wants to have a conversation. Be careful, Ted. Men like Newman don't just want to talk. They want to intimidate, to remind you of your place in the pecking order. Ted nodded gravely. Don't worry. I know exactly what kind of man Raymond Newman is. As Frank walked away, Ted allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 2 was proceeding perfectly. Raymond was scared enough to break cover. Frank was primed to become his unwitting weapon against Newman development, and Ted's investigators had just confirmed that the resort project's financial backing was more fragile than Raymond realized. Tomorrow's meeting would be the beginning of Raymond's downfall. But first, Ted needed to complete one final preparation. He had a phone call to make to a very special kind of lawyer, the kind who specialized in whistleblower protections and construction safety violations. The kind of lawyer who would soon have a very lucrative case to pursue. Chapter 4. The Confrontation. Central Park's south entrance was bustling with afternoon joggers and tourists when Ted arrived at precisely 3 p.m. He spotted Raymond immediately. The man was pacing near the information kiosk, his expensive suit making him stand out among the casual park visitors. Raymond's usual confidence had been replaced by visible agitation, and Ted could see the tension in his shoulders from 50 yards away. Ted approached slowly, maintaining the posture and gait of a man worn down by circumstance. The performance had become second nature after 2 years of practice. Raymond, Ted nodded as he approached. You wanted to talk? Raymond studied Ted's face intently, searching for any sign of deception. Cut the act, Ted. I know what you're doing. I'm not sure what you mean. The watch. Raymond's voice was low but intense. A Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime doesn't just appear in someone's possession. There are only 7 of them in existence, and I know who owns every single one. Ted raised an eyebrow. You seem to know a lot about expensive watches for someone who should be focused on his business. Don't play games with me. I've been making calls, doing research. That watch was sold at auction 6 months ago to an anonymous buyer through a Swiss holding company. $68 million. $68 million? Ted whistled softly. That's quite an appreciation from $2 million. Raymond stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know you're not who you pretend to be. The struggling ex-husband routine might fool Lucille and the kids, but I can smell money, Ted. I always have. Ted met his gaze steadily. And what exactly are you planning to do with this theory of yours? I want to know what your game is. Are you planning to take Lucille for more money? Is this some kind of elaborate fraud to increase your alimony? Because I'll fight you every step of the way. My game. Ted smiled, but there was no warmth in it. My game is very simple, Raymond. I'm a man who lost everything that mattered to him, and now I'm figuring out what comes next. Bullshit. Nobody drops $68 million on a watch if they're actually broke. Ted was quiet for a moment, watching a group of children play on the nearby playground. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of weakness. You're right about one thing, Raymond. I'm not who I pretend to be, but you're wrong about my motivations. Ted turned to face him directly. I don't want more money from Lucille. I want to watch your world burn. The mask had finally dropped, and Raymond took an involuntary step backward at the coldness in Ted's eyes. For 2 years, I've listened to people pity me. My own children think I'm a failure. My ex-wife parades you around as proof that she deserved better than what I could provide. Everyone believes I'm just another middle-aged loser who couldn't keep his family together. Ted, listen. No, you listen. Ted's voice remained calm, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. I know about the safety violations at your construction sites. I know about the bribes you've paid to city inspectors. I know about the substandard materials you've been using to maximize profits. Most importantly, I know about the financial house of cards you've built your empire on. Raymond's face had gone pale. You can't prove any of that. Can I? Ted pulled out his phone and showed Raymond a photograph. It showed Raymond himself shaking hands with a city inspector while an envelope changed hands between them. This was taken outside the municipal building last month. The inspector's name is Eric Sullivan, and he's been taking monthly payments from you for 3 years to overlook code violations. That could be anything. A handshake, a friendly greeting. Ted swiped to the next image. It showed Eric Sullivan opening the envelope and counting the bills inside. $5,000. Cash. The same amount you've been paying him every month to approve inspections on buildings that should never have passed safety requirements. Raymond's hands were shaking now. What do you want? I want you to understand something very important, Ted said, pocketing his phone. When you decided to destroy my marriage, you thought you were taking everything from a weak man who couldn't fight back. You thought wrong. Look, Ted, what happened between Lucille and me started 3 years before a divorce was finalized. I know about every hotel room, every late-night phone call, every time you laughed about my supposed inadequacies. Ted's voice remained level, but his words cut like ice. I know about the plans you made to minimize my settlement, the way you coached Lucille on hiding assets, the private investigator you hired to dig up dirt on me that didn't exist. Raymond was backing away now, but Ted followed him step for step. You see, Raymond, you made one critical error. You assumed that because I appeared weak, I actually was weak. You confused strategic positioning with genuine vulnerability. And now you're about to learn the difference. I can make this right, Raymond said desperately. Whatever you want, money, an apology to the kids, a public admission. What I want is justice. Not the legal kind, not the fair and balanced kind. The kind where the people who destroy others face real consequences for their actions. Ted pulled out a business card and handed it to Raymond. It was for a construction safety attorney named Brendan Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie will be receiving a very detailed package tomorrow morning. Construction photographs, internal company communications, financial records, recorded conversations with city officials. Everything he needs to file the most comprehensive construction fraud case this city has ever seen. Raymond stared at the card in horror. You can't do this. It would destroy everything I've built. Yes, it would. Your company, your reputation, your financial assets, all of it. Just like you destroyed my family. The kids will hate you if they find out you orchestrated this. Ted's expression didn't change. My children already hate me, Raymond. You and Lucille made sure of that. At least this way, they'll eventually understand that their father wasn't the weak man they thought he was. Raymond crumpled the business card in his fist. I won't go down without a fight. I have resources, connections, people who owe me favors. I'm counting on it, Ted replied. I want you to use every resource you have, call in every favor, spend every dollar you can access. Because when you still lose, and you will lose, I want you to understand exactly how thoroughly you've been outmaneuvered. As Ted turned to walk away, Raymond grabbed his arm. Wait, there has to be another way. What if I leave Lucille? What if I disappear from your family's life completely? Ted looked down at Raymond's hand on his arm, then back up at his face. You're 3 years too late for that conversation. He pulled his arm free and started walking toward the park exit. Behind him, he could hear Raymond's voice rising in desperation. This isn't over, Ted. You think you're the only one who can play dirty? I'll expose you to everyone. Your kids, the courts, the IRS. I'll make sure the whole world knows you're a fraud. Ted stopped and turned back one final time. Go ahead, Raymond. Tell everyone that the weak, broken man you've been mocking for 2 years is actually wealthy enough to buy and sell you 10 times over. Tell them how badly you misjudged the situation. Tell them how you got outplayed by someone you thought was beneath you. As Ted walked away, he could see Raymond fumbling for his phone, probably calling his lawyers or his private investigators. It didn't matter. Every move Raymond made from this point forward would only accelerate his downfall. Phase 3 was about to begin, and Ted Graham was done pretending to be anything other than what he truly was, a man with unlimited resources, infinite patience, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. The law offices of Guthrie and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district. Brendan Guthrie was a former federal prosecutor who had built his reputation on taking down corrupt developers and construction companies. When the package arrived at his office the morning after Ted's confrontation with Raymond, Guthrie knew he was looking at the case of a lifetime. Ted watched the news coverage from his penthouse apartment, sipping coffee as reporters gathered outside Newman Development headquarters. The story had broken exactly as he'd planned. Anonymous whistleblower reveals massive construction fraud. Safety violations endanger hundreds of residents. City officials under investigation for bribery. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Monica's number. Dad, are you seeing this? His daughter's voice was excited, almost breathless. That guy Mom married, he's all over the news. They're saying he's been bribing inspectors and using dangerous materials in his buildings. I saw something about it, Ted replied carefully. Must be difficult for your mother. She's devastated. She had no idea about any of this. Raymond's been lying to all of us. Monica paused. Dad, I owe you an apology. Ted's heart clenched. For what? For believing the worst about you. For thinking you were just bitter about the divorce. Mom always said you were jealous of Raymond's success. But maybe you saw something the rest of us didn't. Monica, your mother was trying to protect you. She didn't know any more than the rest of us. But you never said anything bad about Raymond, even when we were defending him. Even when Stephen called you a deadbeat. You just took it. Monica's voice was thick with guilt. You're a better man than I gave you credit for. Ted closed his eyes. His daughter's praise felt like a knife twisting in his chest. If she only knew the truth, that he had orchestrated every aspect of Raymond's downfall, that the anonymous whistleblower was Frank Wells acting on evidence Ted had provided, that the entire investigation was the result of Ted's carefully planned revenge. I should come see you, Monica continued. You shouldn't be alone right now, especially with money being so tight. I'm managing okay, Ted said softly. Dad, please, let me help. I know you're proud, but families should stick together. Maybe this whole thing with Raymond will help Mom see that she made a mistake. After ending the call, Ted stood at his window overlooking the city. For blocks away, he could see the Newman Development building where reporters were still gathered. By now, Raymond would be meeting with his crisis management team, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. What he didn't know was that Ted had 3 more devastating revelations scheduled to drop over the next week. Ted's phone buzzed with a text from Bob Briggs. Newman's attorney called an emergency meeting with all the resort investors. He's trying to keep them from pulling funding. But the environmental groups are planning a major protest tomorrow. Also, Eric Sullivan, the inspector, just lawyered up and is talking about a plea deal. Everything was proceeding exactly as Ted had planned. The beauty of his strategy was that every piece of evidence was genuine. Raymond had actually committed every crime he was being accused of. Ted had simply ensured that the evidence came to light in the most damaging way possible. The next call came from Lucille. Ted, I need to ask you something. Her voice was shaky, all traces of her usual superiority gone. Did you know about Raymond? Before the divorce, I mean. Did you know what kind of man he was? Ted considered his words carefully. I knew he was the kind of man who would sleep with another man's wife. That told me everything I needed to know about his character. I'm so sorry, Lucille whispered. For everything. For the affair, for the things I said about you, for turning the kids against you. I thought Raymond was successful and stable, but it was all built on lies. Lucille, no, let me finish. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I was wrong. About you, about us, about what I thought I wanted. She was crying now. Raymond's lawyers are saying he might go to prison. The house is mortgaged to pay for his legal defense. I'm going to lose everything. Ted felt no satisfaction in her tears. The revenge he'd sought wasn't about Lucille's suffering. It was about justice. About ensuring that the people who had betrayed him faced consequences for their actions. What will you do? He asked. I don't know. Go back to work, I suppose. Try to rebuild. The kids are talking about moving back in with me to help with expenses. She laughed bitterly. Ironic, isn't it? After all these years of them thinking you were the failure, now they're having to take care of their mother. They love you, Lucille. Whatever mistakes you've made, they love you. Do you hate me, Ted? For what I did to our family? Ted was quiet for a long moment. No, I don't hate you. But I don't forgive you either. I understand. Her voice was barely audible. I deserve that. After the call ended, Ted opened his laptop and began typing an email to his attorney. It was time for phase 4 of his plan, the revelation of his true financial status. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of legitimately reclaiming his public identity as a successful businessman. The scared, broken ex-husband act had served its purpose. But first, he had one more phone call to make. Frank Wells answered on the second ring. Ted, have you been watching the news? I have. Congratulations, Frank. You did the right thing. I'm still processing it all. When that lawyer called and said he wanted to meet, I almost hung up on him. But when I saw all that evidence you collected, I knew I had to act. You're going to be the star witness in the biggest construction fraud case this city has ever seen. That takes courage. Courage? I'm terrified. Newman's people have been calling, offering money, making threats. My lawyer says I need police protection. You'll be fine, Frank. The FBI is involved now, and they take witness intimidation very seriously. I keep thinking about all those families living in buildings with substandard materials. What if there's an earthquake? What if there's a fire and the safety systems fail? Frank's voice was heavy with the weight of responsibility. I should have spoken up years ago. You're speaking up now. That's what matters. After ending the call, Ted poured himself another glass of Macallan and returned to the window. The city lights stretched out before him like a constellation of lives and dreams. Somewhere out there, Raymond Newman was discovering what it felt like to watch his world collapse in real time. Somewhere else, Lucille was confronting the reality of her choices. And in various apartments and houses throughout the city, his children were reassessing everything they thought they knew about their father. Ted had won. Raymond would face criminal charges, financial ruin, and public humiliation. Lucille would spend years rebuilding a life based on honest work rather than manipulated relationships. The corrupt city officials would be exposed and prosecuted. But victory felt different than Ted had expected. Colder. More hollow. His phone buzzed with another text. This one from Stephen. Dad, I saw the news about Raymond. I owe you an apology. Can we talk? Ted stared at the message for a long time before responding. Come by tomorrow evening. We have a lot to discuss. The final phase of his plan was about to begin. His children deserved to know the truth about who their father really was. All of it, including the parts that would horrify them. Chapter 6, The Truth Unveiled. Stephen Graham stood outside his father's apartment building in Riverside Heights, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets against the October chill. At 20 years old, he had inherited his father's lean build and analytical mind, but the past 2 years had hardened his features with premature cynicism. He'd come here to apologize, but admitting he'd been wrong about his father felt like swallowing glass. Ted opened the door wearing the same worn clothes and weary expression Stephen had grown accustomed to seeing. The modest apartment looked exactly as Stephen expected. Second-hand furniture, a small television, the trappings of a man barely getting by. Thanks for coming, Ted said, stepping aside to let him in. Monica said I should talk to you. About Raymond, about everything. Stephen couldn't quite meet his father's eyes. I guess I owe you an apology. Sit down, Stephen. We need to have a conversation. They settled into the small living room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Stephen had rehearsed this moment during the bus ride over, but now that he was here, the words felt inadequate. I was wrong about you, Stephen finally said. About calling you a deadbeat. About saying Raymond was more of a man than you were. I thought you were just bitter and jealous, but you saw what he really was when the rest of us were blind. Ted studied his son's face. What do you think you were wrong about, exactly? About thinking you were weak. About believing Mom when she said you couldn't provide for our family properly. Stephen's voice grew stronger as he continued. You never fought back when we criticized you. You never defended yourself. I thought that made you pathetic, but maybe it just made you dignified. And what if I told you that everything you believed about me was a carefully constructed lie? Stephen frowned. What do you mean? Ted stood up and walked to the window. Stephen, I need you to understand something. The man you've been visiting for the past 2 years, the struggling ex-husband living in a studio apartment, that person doesn't exist. Dad, I don't understand. The apartment we're sitting in is rented under a false name. I've never spent a single night here. I maintain it purely for appearances. Ted turned back to face his son. Just like I've maintained everything else about this identity. Stephen's confusion was giving way to something approaching alarm. What are you talking about? Ted walked to a bookshelf and removed what appeared to be a worn paperback novel. He opened it to reveal a hidden compartment containing a key card and a set of car keys. My real home is a penthouse apartment 20 minutes from here. I own it outright, along with several others. The consulting business your mother thought she took in the divorce? I sold it for $47 million before we ever filed papers. Stephen stared at him in shock. That's impossible. I've been worth north of $50 million since before your mother's affair began. The struggling to find work routine, the riding the bus, the modest lifestyle, all of it was performance art designed to make everyone believe I had lost everything in the divorce. But why? Why would you pretend to be poor? Ted's expression grew cold. Because I wanted Raymond and your mother to feel secure in their victory before I destroyed them. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Stephen felt his worldview cracking apart as the implications sank in. The evidence against Raymond, Stephen whispered. The whistleblower report, the safety violations. All real, all documented through surveillance and investigation that I funded. Raymond Newman is a criminal, and he's going to prison because I made sure his crimes came to light. Stephen shot to his feet. You orchestrated all of this. The investigation, the arrests, the destruction of his company. Every piece of it. But Mom, she's lost everything. The house, her security, her reputation. She made her choices, Stephen. She chose to have an affair. She chose to turn you and Monica against me. She chose to build her new life on the foundation of someone else's criminal enterprise. Stephen was backing toward the door now, his face pale with horror. What kind of man does something like this? What kind of father ruins his children's lives for revenge? The kind who doesn't forgive betrayal. Ted's voice remained perfectly calm. The kind who understands that actions have consequences. We're your children. You stopped being my children the moment you chose her side over mine. The moment you called me a deadbeat and moved in with the man who destroyed our family. Stephen's hand was on the doorknob now. This is insane. You're insane. I'm methodical. There's a difference. I have to tell Monica. I have to tell Mom. Go ahead, Ted said with a slight smile. Tell them that the weak, pathetic ex-husband they've been pitying is actually wealthy enough to buy and sell their new family 10 times over. Tell them that every move they've made for the past 2 years has been exactly what I wanted them to make. Stephen opened the door, then stopped. Why are you telling me this? Why reveal everything now? Because Raymond's destruction is complete, and I want you all to understand exactly how thoroughly you misjudged me. I want you to spend the rest of your lives knowing that when you had the chance to stand by your father, you chose his enemies instead. We didn't know. You didn't want to know. You found it easier to believe I was a failure than to question your mother's version of events. Stephen stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at his father as if seeing him for the first time. I don't know who you are. I'm the same man I've always been, Stephen. You just never bothered to look beneath the surface. After Stephen left, Ted returned to his window. His phone was already ringing, probably Stephen calling Monica, starting the chain reaction that would spread the truth through his family like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Ted Graham wasn't the man they thought he was. His revenge was complete, but it had come at a price he was only now beginning to understand. He had won the war, but he had sacrificed any hope of reconciliation with his children in the process. They would never forgive him for the deception, for the manipulation, for the cold calculation that had destroyed their stepfather and left their mother financially ruined. Ted raised his glass of Macallan in a silent toast to his empty apartment. He had become exactly what he'd always been accused of being, a man alone, surrounded by the ruins of relationships that could never be rebuilt. The difference was that now he no longer cared. Chapter 7, The Reckoning. The emergency family meeting was called for Sunday evening at Monica's apartment. She lived in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, the kind of trendy space that young professionals with good jobs could afford. As Ted approached the building, he could see the warm light from her windows and the silhouettes of people moving around inside. He had decided to attend as himself for the first time in 2 years. The custom-tailored suit was charcoal gray, understated but unmistakably expensive. The shoes were Italian leather. The watch, a different Patek Philippe, slightly less ostentatious than the Grandmaster chime, caught the light as he pressed the buzzer. When Monica's voice came through the intercom, she didn't recognize the man standing at her door. "I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong apartment," she said. "It's me, Monica. It's your father." The long pause that followed told Ted everything he needed to know about Stephen's phone calls. The door buzzed open. Monica was waiting in the hallway when the elevator opened, her face a mixture of confusion and something approaching fear. Ted had always been proud of his eldest daughter. She had inherited her mother's artistic sensibilities, but tempered them with practical intelligence. She worked as a graphic designer for a nonprofit and had built a life based on genuine accomplishment rather than manipulation. "Dad," she whispered. "Hello, Monica." She stared at him for a long moment, taking in the expensive clothes, the confident posture, the subtle but unmistakable signs of wealth. "Stephen said, he told me things, but I didn't believe that your father isn't who you thought he was." "It's true." Monica stepped aside to let him into the apartment. Lucille was sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. She looked older than her 52 years, worn down by the stress of Raymond's arrest and the financial collapse that had followed. Stephen stood by the windows, his arms crossed, anger radiating from every line of his body. "Well," Lucille said, her voice hoarse, "I guess the family reunion is complete." Ted surveyed the room. His ex-wife and children gathered together in crisis, united in their shared sense of betrayal. It was almost poetic. "Stephen told us," Monica said, closing the door behind him, "about the money, about the apartment, about everything." "Not everything," Ted corrected. "Just the parts he could understand." "Explain it to us then," Monica demanded. "Explain how the father we thought we knew could systematically destroy people's lives for revenge." Ted moved to the center of the room, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller. "What would you like to know?" "How I discovered your mother's affair 3 years before she filed for divorce. How I listened to recordings of her and Raymond laughing about my supposed inadequacies. How I watched you both choose his side without ever asking for my version of events." "We were protecting Mom," Stephen said defensively. "From what?" "From the consequences of her own choices." Lucille looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. "Ted, please. I know I hurt you, but what you've done to Raymond, to our family, this isn't justice. This is cruelty. Justice would have been you being honest about your affair instead of making me look like a fool for 3 years. Justice would have been my children asking questions instead of automatically believing I was the villain." Ted's voice remained calm, but the words cut like razors. "What you got was consequences." Monica stepped between them. "Dad, Raymond's going to prison. Mom's lost her home. The kids at my school are talking about their parents being afraid their apartments aren't safe because of the buildings Raymond constructed. You've hurt innocent people. I exposed a criminal who was endangering lives for profit. Those buildings would have collapsed eventually. Earthquake, fire, structural failure. I potentially save hundreds of people from injury or death by manipulating and destroying our family. Your family was destroyed the moment your mother decided to have an affair. Everything that's happened since then has just been the logical progression of choices that were made without my input." Stephen moved away from the window, his fists clenched. "You're a sociopath. Normal people don't plan elaborate revenge schemes that take years to execute. Normal people don't have their wives cheat on them with criminals while their children call them failures." Ted's composure finally cracked slightly, a flash of genuine anger breaking through. "Normal people don't spend 2 years listening to their own family pity them while secretly knowing they could buy everyone's problems away with pocket change." "Then why didn't you?" Monica asked, tears starting to flow. "If you really loved us, why didn't you just fix everything? Why didn't you help us?" "Because you never asked for my help. You asked for my compliance, my acceptance of your version of events, my quiet disappearance from your lives. You got exactly what you asked for." Lucille stood up slowly, her movements shaky. "I'm calling the police. What you've done, the surveillance, the manipulation, the destruction of evidence, some of it has to be illegal." Ted smiled coldly. "Go ahead. Explain to them how your ex-husband gathered evidence of actual crimes and turned it over to the proper authorities. Explain how he used his own money to fund legitimate investigations." Explain how every piece of evidence against Raymond Newman was collected legally and presented through appropriate channels. You've been watching us for 2 years. I've been protecting myself from a woman who had already demonstrated her willingness to lie and manipulate for personal gain. Given your history, surveillance seemed prudent. Monica collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands. I don't understand how you became this person. The father I remember was kind and gentle. He would never hurt people like this. The father you remember was weak, Ted replied. He believed that love and trust and good intentions were enough to hold a family together. He learned otherwise. So you decided to become a monster instead? I decided to become someone who couldn't be betrayed again. The room fell silent except for the sound of Lucille's quiet crying. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the family destroying itself 20 stories above the streets. Finally, Stephen spoke. What do you want from us now? Why reveal everything? Why not just disappear and let us rebuild our lives? Ted considered the question seriously. Because I wanted you to understand the cost of your choices. I wanted you to know that when you had the opportunity to stand by your father, you chose his enemies instead. I wanted you to spend the rest of your lives knowing exactly how wrong you were about everything. And now that we know, Monica asked, now you live with it, just like I've lived with your betrayal. Ted turned toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, I never wanted it to end this way. I gave all of you multiple opportunities to question the narrative you'd been fed, to ask for my side of the story, to wonder if maybe the man you'd known for decades might not have suddenly become the failure you were told he was. We were children trying to understand our parents' divorce, Monica said desperately. You were adults who chose the easier story over the complicated truth. As Ted reached for the door handle, Lucille called out one final time. Ted, wait. Is there any part of you that can forgive us? Any chance for our family to find a way forward? Ted paused with his hand on the door. No, Lucille, there isn't. Some things can't be forgiven. Some betrayals are permanent. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the broken remains of a family that had never really understood him at all. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into freedom. Chapter 8. The Price of Victory. 6 months after the revelation, Ted stood in the federal courthouse watching Raymond Newman receive his sentence. 15 years for construction fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The judge had been particularly harsh, noting that Raymond's crimes had put hundreds of families at risk and undermined public trust in construction safety standards. Raymond looked smaller than Ted remembered. The expensive suits and confident demeanor had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit and the hollow stare of a man who had lost everything. When their eyes met across the courtroom, Raymond mouthed a single word, "Why?" Ted didn't respond. The question itself revealed how little Raymond understood about consequences. Frank Wells sat in the gallery, his role as the key whistleblower having transformed him from an unemployed construction worker into a federal witness with a new identity and a substantial reward from the government's whistleblower program. He nodded to Ted as they filed out of the courtroom, a gesture of acknowledgement between two men who had brought justice to a corrupt system. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their cameras and microphones. Ted walked past them without comment, but he could hear the questions being shouted. Mr. Newman, do you have anything to say to the families affected by your husband's crimes? The question was directed at Lucille, who had attended the sentencing despite their divorce. Ted didn't turn around to see her response. His phone buzzed with a text from Bob Briggs. Newman's assets have been fully liquidated for victim compensation. The civil suits are settled. Your involvement remains completely sealed in all court documents. The legal victories were complete, but Ted found little satisfaction in them. Raymond was going to prison, the corrupt city officials had been prosecuted, and the construction company had been dissolved with its assets used to compensate the families living in unsafe buildings. Justice had been served by any objective measure, but the personal cost had been higher than Ted had anticipated. Monica had moved to Portland 3 months ago, taking a job with an environmental nonprofit. She'd sent him a letter explaining that she needed distance from everything that had happened, space to figure out who she was in relation to a father she felt she'd never really known. The letter was polite but final. She wasn't cutting contact completely, but she wasn't ready for a relationship either. Stephen had been more direct. He'd sent a single text message. "I understand why you did what you did, but I can't forgive how you did it. Don't contact me again." Lucille had moved back to her sister's house in Ohio, where she was slowly rebuilding her life as a freelance interior designer. She'd sent Ted one final message through their mutual attorney, an offer to return the money from their divorce settlement. Ted had declined. She had earned that money through 15 years of marriage, and her betrayal didn't erase that fact. The isolation had become Ted's new normal. He'd stopped maintaining the facade of poverty, moving openly into his penthouse apartment and resuming his role as a legitimate businessman. But the relationships that might have given meaning to his success were gone, severed by choices that couldn't be undone. Ted's penthouse office overlooked the harbor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that cost more per month than most people's annual salaries. He spent his days managing investments, developing new technologies, and building a business empire that would outlast him by decades. But the work felt mechanical now, a way to occupy time rather than a source of purpose. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Graham, there's a young woman here to see you. She says she's your daughter." Ted's heart jumped. "Send her up." But when the elevator doors opened, it wasn't Monica or even someone he recognized. The woman was in her early 20s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. "Mr. Graham? I'm Sarah Newman, Raymond's daughter from his first marriage." Ted studied her face, seeing traces of Raymond's features softened by youth and what appeared to be genuine integrity. "What can I do for you, Sarah? I wanted to thank you." The words were so unexpected that Ted nearly laughed. "Thank me for stopping my father before he hurt more people. I've known about his business practices for years, but I was too afraid to speak up. I was financially dependent on him, and I told myself that maybe I was wrong, maybe the safety violations weren't as bad as they seemed." Sarah moved into the office, her posture straight, but her hands betraying nervous energy. "When the news broke about the investigation, I felt guilty and relieved at the same time. Guilty because I should have acted sooner, relieved because someone finally had the courage to do what I couldn't. You were his daughter. The situation was more complicated for you. Was it, or was I just protecting my own comfort?" Sarah shook her head. "I've been reading about the case, about the families who were living in unsafe buildings. Some of them have children. What if there had been an earthquake? What if one of those buildings had collapsed?" Ted gestured for her to sit down. "What will you do now?" "I'm finishing my degree in structural engineering. I want to make sure buildings are constructed safely, properly. I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." "That's admirable." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at him. "I also wanted to apologize for what my father did to your family. The affair, the manipulation, the way he turned your children against you. I know about all of it. You're not responsible for your father's actions. Maybe not, but I benefited from them. The money he spent on my education, the apartment he helped me afford, the internships he arranged through his business connections. All of it was built on illegal activities and the destruction of your marriage." Ted studied her face, seeing none of Raymond's calculating coldness. "What do you expect me to do with your apology?" "Nothing. I just needed to say it." Sarah stood up to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're a good man who was pushed too far by people who underestimated you. But I also think you've paid a price for your revenge that might be higher than what you gained." After she left, Ted returned to his window, overlooking the harbor. Sarah Newman's words echoed in his mind. A price higher than what you gained. It was an assessment that Ted had been avoiding, but it felt undeniably true. He had destroyed Raymond Newman completely. He had exposed corruption and potentially saved lives. He had proven that underestimating him was a mistake that carried serious consequences. But he had also lost his children, possibly forever. He had spent 2 years living a lie, becoming someone he didn't recognize. He had chosen revenge over reconciliation, justice over mercy, victory over healing. The city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one representing a life, a family, a story of connection and love and loss. Ted Graham stood alone among them all, wealthy beyond measure and poorer than he had ever been. Chapter 9. The Final Move. 2 years later, Ted Graham sat in his private office reviewing the latest quarterly reports from Graham Industries, the technology conglomerate he'd built from the shell companies that had hidden his wealth during the divorce. The business had grown exponentially, developing innovative solutions for everything from cybersecurity to sustainable construction materials. The irony wasn't lost on him that his company was now leading the industry in the same construction safety protocols that had been used to destroy Raymond Newman. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered with a familiar expression of confusion. "Mr. Graham, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says he's your son, but—" She trailed off, clearly uncertain. Stephen Graham had changed significantly in the 2 years since their last encounter. The angry young man had been replaced by someone older, more serious, with the kind of weathered confidence that came from hard experience. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit and carried himself with a dignity that reminded Ted of his own father. "Stephen, Dad." They stood looking at each other across the office, two men separated by more than just physical distance. Finally, Stephen moved closer, his eyes taking in the office's understated luxury, the view of the harbor, the subtle displays of wealth and power. "I've been following your company," Stephen said. "Graham Industries. The construction safety innovations, the whistleblower protection programs you've funded, the scholarships for children of families affected by unsafe buildings. Good investments," Ted replied carefully. "Are they? Or are they your attempt at atonement?" Ted gestured for Stephen to sit down, but his son remained standing. "I came here to tell you something," Stephen continued. "About Monica, about Mom, about what's happened to our family since everything came out. I'm listening. Monica's doing well in Portland. She's built a good life for herself, but she thinks about you every day. She keeps articles about Graham Industries in a folder on her desk. She's proud of what you've accomplished, but she's afraid to reach out because she doesn't know if you'd want to hear from her." Ted felt something crack inside his chest. "And your mother?" "Mom's remarried. A high school principal in Ohio. Good man, honest work, nothing like Raymond. She's happy, or as happy as someone could be after what she's been through." Stephen paused. "She talks about you sometimes. About the man she fell in love with before everything went wrong." "Stephen, why are you here?" "Because I figured something out about you, Dad. Something it took me 2 years to understand." Stephen moved to the window, looking out at the harbor where cargo ships moved slowly toward the horizon. "You destroyed Raymond Newman because he was a criminal who was endangering lives. But you destroyed our family because we hurt you and you wanted us to understand what that felt like. That's one way to look at it. Is it accurate?" Ted considered the question seriously. "It's part of the truth." "What's the other part?" "The other part is that I became so focused on being strong that I forgot how to be vulnerable. I became so determined never to be betrayed again that I made betrayal inevitable." Stephen turned back to face him. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If you could go back and do things differently, knowing what you know now about the cost, would you?" Ted had asked himself the same question hundreds of times over the past 2 years. The answer had evolved as he'd watched his business grow, as he'd seen the impact of his construction safety initiatives, as he'd felt the weight of his isolation. "I would still have exposed Raymond's crimes," Ted said finally. "People's lives were at stake, and he needed to be stopped. But I would have done it differently. I would have tried to separate justice from revenge. And us, your family, I would have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. I would have fought for you instead of writing you off." Ted's voice grew quieter. "I would have remembered that love requires forgiveness, and forgiveness requires strength, not weakness." Stephen was silent for a long moment. "Monica wants to see you. So does Mom, believe it or not. We've all spent the past 2 years trying to understand what happened to our family, and we've come to some conclusions. Such as that you were right about Raymond, that Mom made terrible choices that hurt everyone, that we were unfair to you during the divorce." Stephen paused, "but also that your response was disproportionate to the crime. That revenge isn't the same as justice. That destroying people, even people who've wronged you, doesn't actually heal anything." Ted nodded slowly. "All fair assessments. There's something else." Stephen reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Mom wanted me to give you this. Ted opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single photograph, their family at Christmas 15 years ago. Monica and Stephen were still children, their faces bright with excitement. Lucille was laughing at something Ted had said. Ted himself looked genuinely happy, his arm around his wife, his children close by. On the back, Lucille had written a single line. This was real, too. Ted stared at the photograph for a long time, remembering the man he'd been before betrayal had hardened him into someone else. That man had been capable of forgiveness, of second chances, of believing in redemption. What would it take? Ted asked quietly. For what? For our family to find a way forward. Not back to what we were. That's impossible. But forward to something new. Stephen sat down for the first time since entering the office. It would take time. It would take forgiveness from all of us, including you. It would take accepting that we're all different people now, and figuring out if we can love who we've become. And if we can't, then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll know that we chose healing over anger, connection over isolation. Ted looked out at the harbor, where the sun was beginning to set over the water. Somewhere in Portland, Monica was finishing her workday, probably thinking about the father she'd lost to his own need for revenge. Somewhere in Ohio, Lucille was making dinner for a man who loved her without conditions or expectations of perfection. And here in his office, his son was offering him something he'd thought was lost forever, a chance to be a father again. There's one more thing, Stephen said. Something I need you to know before you decide. What's that? I forgive you, Dad. For the lies, for the manipulation, for choosing revenge over family. I understand why you did it, and I forgive you for it. The words hit Ted like a physical blow. In all his planning, all his strategies for victory and vindication, he'd never considered the possibility that forgiveness might be offered freely, without conditions or surrender. Why? Ted asked, his voice barely audible. Because you're my father. Because love doesn't end just because people make terrible choices. Because forgiveness isn't about whether someone deserves it. It's about whether you're strong enough to offer it. Ted Graham, brilliant strategist, successful businessman, architect of perfect revenge, sat in his expensive office and wept for the first time in 4 years. What happens now? He asked when he could speak again. Now we see if the man who built all this, Stephen gestured around the office, still remembers how to be the man from that photograph. Ted looked at the picture again, his family as they'd been, before betrayal and revenge had torn them apart. It was a different kind of victory than he'd originally sought, one that required vulnerability instead of strength, forgiveness instead of justice, hope instead of certainty. It was the only victory that mattered. Tell Monica I'd like to see her, Ted said finally. Tell your mother I kept the photograph too, the one from our wedding day. Tell her I remember what was real. Stephen smiled, and for the first time in years, Ted saw his son as he truly was. Not a betrayer or an enemy, but a young man who'd learned how to forgive the unforgivable. Outside the window, the harbor lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, each one a beacon guiding ships safely home. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.